Okay, welcome Year 9. This is your first lesson on Charles Dickens's novel A Christmas Carol. And what we're going to do to start with for the first lesson is just look at a little bit of the context of where this novel came from. So what was happening around the time, how was Dickens influenced to write what he wrote, because that's always an important part of what we do when we're studying literature. So the idea here is that we read this text, and as we go along we'll find questions which you need to answer in full sentences, please. So starting with his life, he lived from 1812 to 1870. Charles Dickens was born into a middle-class Victorian family in Portsmouth, which is in the south of England, in 1812. However, he experienced the effects of falling into sudden poverty firsthand. He was taken out of school and then, aged 12, was sent to work at a factory called Warren's Blacking Factory, fixing labels on tins of boot blacking. Now, blacking was what we now call boot polish. Eventually, heavily in debt, his father was imprisoned in Marshalsea debtors' prison, and his wife and the other 7 children went with him. Now, a debtors' prison, you see there, is something we don't have anymore. But in those days, if you fell into serious debt and you couldn't pay it back, you would often be put in what they called a debtor's prison, and then you'd be required to work off your debt in pretty horrible conditions. The boy, though, Dickens, Charles, aged 12, carried on working and living alone and struggling to earn enough money to pay for his food and his accommodation each week. And he saw the miseries suffered by poor families and their children, and he never forgot these experiences when his writing helped him lead his family out of poverty. Dickens became a lifelong champion of the poor, firstly using the opportunity of working as a parliamentary reporter to write up accounts of debates surrounding child labour for newspapers, and then as he began to write non-fiction and then fiction. So a parliamentary reporter, like a journalist, somebody working for a newspaper, who would go to Parliament, listen to the debates and then write about them for the newspaper. And then he moved on from there to start writing fiction. And of course this novel is fiction, as in made up, not true, a story, but based on the conditions of the time. In his novels, Dickens created grotesque, wealthy, middle-class characters whose treatment of poor characters mimicked the wrongs going on in Victorian society. He also showed the connection between poverty and crime, with some of his characters being led into crime by their circumstances rather than by ill nature. He hoped to spur his middle-class readers into changing and taking action to improve conditions for the poor. As well as earning money to support his wife and children, Dickens made sure that as many people as possible would hear his ideas by touring Britain and eventually America to read his novels aloud to audiences, much as pop stars and comedians tour today, with the intention of both entertaining listeners and making them think. Okay, so he was a very popular writer at the time. And now here's your first 2 questions. 1. How might Dickens's early life have influenced his views and attitudes towards Victorian society? And 2. If Dickens had been the Prime Minister at the time, what kind of changes might he have made? What do you think he would have done if he had the power to change things? So if you want to, you can answer those now and pause the video, or you can just carry on and then answer them all at the end. It's up to you. So, moving on. Social responsibility in Victorian England. So to be socially responsible, if you're socially responsible, you'd be somebody who worries about and does something about those people that are less fortunate than you, that don't have as much money as you. Before the beginning of the 19th century, the rich English aristocracy, and that would be the very rich people in the country, had recognised that their privileged position meant that they had a responsibility to take care of those less fortunate than themselves. However, after the Industrial Revolution, when manufacturing developed, there was a newly rich middle class who made their money from running factories and owning businesses. they had a very different attitude to the poor. These business owners, like the central character Scrooge in this novel A Christmas Carol, believed that with enough effort anyone could succeed, and ignored the fact that much of their own wealth was built on taking advantage of the poor, like one of the characters Bob Cratchit and his daughter, and the miners, which are other characters we see in the novel. The poor had to accept low wages and terrible working conditions rather than starve. So basically the Industrial Revolution made a huge difference, where we would get big factories and coal mines and places where the poor worked for very low wages and had very few rights. And it meant that huge slums grew up in large cities, and the owners of these new factories and mines and mills were able to take advantage and make a lot of money, but the poor, those people working in the factories and the mills and the mines, suffered. When Dickens was just a child, what was called the Poor Law meant that the parish gave help to local poor people. This meant that the old and the sick and those struggling to support their families remained part of their community and could still contribute to it. However, as time went on, some employers deliberately paid their workers very low wages so that they could make a larger profit, knowing that the parish, the local government, would have to make up their income. So therefore this led the parishes to raise taxes to gather enough money to support the increasing number of poor people. Not surprisingly, the Poor Law became very unpopular with the new middle-class taxpayers, so the people who owned these factories and things like that. So as a result, in the 1834, a law was brought out called the Poor Law Amendment Act, and that ruled that only those poor who could not work would be helped, and they would have to leave their homes to go and live and work in what was called a workhouse and wear its uniform. Now the workhouses were these great big buildings where people who couldn't support themselves were forced to go and live and work. And they were like prisons, really. The conditions in workhouses were dreadful. As a result, the poor feared being sent to workhouses and therefore would rather starve. Often they got into debt and, like Dickens's father, were imprisoned and punished. The treadmill, which Scrooge refers to in the first chapter, in Stave 1 as it's called in the novel, was one of the punishments. Prisoners had to walk the treadmill for up to 10 hours a day, 10 minutes on, 5 minutes off. In some prisons the treadmill was used to grind flour, but often it was just a punishment. Dickens believed that education was key to ending poverty, and symbolised this in the characters of want and ignorance in his novel in the third chapter, Stave 3. He persuaded a wealthy friend, Angela Burdett Coutts, to finance some of what he called the ragged schools, so called because their pupils had worn out clothes, and these schools were designed to educate poor children. So, next questions, number 3 and 4. How did the 1834 Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, I've repeated that, sorry, make things worse for the poor? Okay, so I'll get rid of that. There we go, that makes more sense. And number 4, what did Dickens think was the key to ending poverty? So as I say, you can write that now, or you can wait till the end. Victorian values. In Victorian England, the majority of people attended church, described themselves as Christian, and knew the Bible, its holy book, quite thoroughly. However, in Dickens's view, many middle-class people did not live out the ideals it contained. Instead, they justified their selfish behaviour using the political beliefs of Jeremy Bentham, a political thinker who argued that workhouses were efficient, and Thomas Malthus, who believed that by helping the poor, the government would just ensure that the population of the poor would grow. So, even though it was quite a religious society at the Victorian England, Dickens thought that people were being hypocritical, and that he felt that people might say that they believed in Jesus' teachings and helping the poor and things like this, but they didn't actually follow it through. And we had leading political thinkers and philosophers like Jeremy Bentham and like Thomas Malthus, who had some pretty horrible views. And this view here is one that Scrooge in the novel actually believes himself, which is that if you help the poor, well, they'll just carry on, and they'll breed more and there'll be more poor, so you might as well just let them die, which is a pretty horrible idea, but that's the kind of ideas that some people had. But Dickens challenged these views by making one of the most important Christian celebrations, that's Christmas Day, central to the novel A Christmas Carol. He names the three ghosts sent to teach Scrooge his lesson. There's the ghost of Christmas present, Christmas past, and Christmas yet to come. Their purpose is to show Scrooge that it is better to spend life loving people rather than money, and caring not only for those close to you, such as your family and your employees, but everyone in the community, especially the poor and the sick. So you probably know this story because there's lots of versions of it, but Scrooge, this rather horrible, miserly character, he sent these three ghosts come to teach him a lesson. A central Christian teaching on which Dickens focuses in the novel is the idea that God wants to give people the chance to understand how they're going wrong and the opportunity to change. Marley brings this hope to Scrooge at the end of Stave 1, or Chapter 1, while also acting as a warning of the terrible consequences for people who, like him, live only for themselves and do not care for others. Now, one of the ghosts that comes to him is called Marley. Marley has begged for mercy for Scrooge, and so the three Christmas ghosts are sent to show Scrooge that his mean and selfish attitude toward his fellow man is wrong. By the end of the story, Scrooge has learned all his lesson and wholeheartedly changed, becoming generous and caring. In the preface, Dickens expresses the hope that his readers will also change. So the preface is just this, which is in front of you now, just two sentences where Dickens, before the story starts, just gives a little note to the reader about what his intentions are. And if we quickly look at it, he says, "I have endeavoured," and that means I've tried, "in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it." Now what he means here, if it's not quite clear to you, is I have tried with this little book of mine to raise an idea, and that idea is what we've been talking about, the idea of social responsibility, the idea of looking after people less fortunate than yourselves, which he says he hopes will not put my readers out of humour with themselves, which won't upset them, or put them out of humour with each other, won't make them argue, or with the idea of Christmas, the season. He doesn't want to ruin their Christmas with this little ghost story, he says. But what he does want is he wants this little story to haunt their houses pleasantly, meaning he wants it to stick around. He wants the idea of looking after each other and looking after the poor as something he wants to haunt them. He wants it to stay with them, just like a ghost might haunt somebody, I suppose. And no one wished to lay it. Now the idea being to, I don't know if you've heard the phrase, to lay a ghost to rest, which means he doesn't want you to just leave it alone. He doesn't want you to leave it alone. He doesn't want to let it rest. He wants you to stick with the idea, and the ghost of an idea being that we think about each other and rather than ourselves. He was not disappointed. The book became hugely popular and affected middle-class Victorians' attitudes towards the poor. Dickens toured, giving public readings of A Christmas Carol and spreading its message widely. He continued to write fiction, expressing social criticisms, and campaigned with others to see huge social reform. Gradually, the Victorian period became one of social improvement, with laws introduced to end slavery and child labour, the British Factory Act reducing daily working hours for women and children, and Education Acts establishing school attendance. So your two questions here. Why do you think Dickens chose Christmas as the focus for the novel? And how do you think how did the Victorians try to improve conditions for the poor? Last bit now. Christmas celebrations. During Dickens's childhood, Christmas Day was a working day for most people and not widely celebrated. However, as a young child, his family had celebrated Christmas and he enjoyed making it a day of great family enjoyment for his own children. Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, was German and introduced his Christmas traditions, which gradually became popular in England. Many of these customs are still associated with Christmas Day, such as decorating a Christmas tree, sending cards. The first commercial ones were sent in the year A Christmas Carol was published in 1843. Also singing carols and exchanging gifts. A Christmas Carol also had an impact on Christmas customs. Ghost stories were very popular reading for Victorians, especially on Christmas Eve, and Dickens used this popular genre to express his ideas, which is why he had ghosts in the story. The first editions of Christmas Carol were published as a lavishly produced Christmas gift. Like the reformed character of Scrooge, Victorian middle-class employers began to give their employees the day off and taking responsibility for their welfare. Increasingly, families feasted together, ate Christmas pudding, played games, and gave gifts to the poor. So, don't forget that for a minute. Last question. 7. Why do you think Dickens called this novel a carol? Now, you know what a Christmas carol is. It's a song, isn't it? Think about the messages in carols and how people feel when they hear them.